Hello, my lovely viewers, and welcome to yet another interview today with a person some of you might know as Lorgate Dale, who has written for such publications as Huffington Post and The Guardian, and is currently the Distracto's UK news editor. And some of you might know her as Laura, the person who talks about video game bots and weird sex game. Laura, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to chat with you today.
No problem. So I already gave you a brief introduction, but why don't you tell a little bit about your career with your own words, because you do a lot of stuff in a lot of places.
Yeah, my career is a very weird one. I'm currently UK editor at Distractoid. I write news Monday to Friday in the mornings and run a little news team over there. I also do about 9 podcasts a week. I'm involved in the Podquisition podcast with Jim Sterling, as long as a bunch of other considerably less successful but still enjoyable podcasts. I have a Patreon which is doing pretty well, and that funds me doing videos about butts and videos about games that have weird sex with animals in them. Very weird esoteric video games. And then I sometimes, very rarely, write really serious stuff. So I sometimes do Taki, Guardian, Polygon, places like that. So nice mix of news, serious features, and joking about butts.
Yeah. And as far as I understand, you're not exactly a newcomer when it comes to game journalism, but you're not exactly an industry veteran yet. So how long exactly have you been doing journalism as a full-time profession?
Okay, so as writing about video games, I first started completely unpaid about 3 years ago. About the first 2.5 years of my career were largely unpaid. I did a little bit of paid work here and there, a few freelance features. Most of what I did was unpaid. It was around 6 months ago, back in, I think it was late October, my job unexpectedly and made a big push to try and make this financially viable. And
sorry,
yeah, I've now been.
Could you repeat that? We were having a bit of technical difficulties.
No problem. So yeah, about 6 months ago, I lost my day job, and I took a chance to be like, right, let's try and do this full time, and it seems to have worked out. So I've now been writing about video games full time for about 6 months. Before that, there was 2.5 years of slowly laying the groundwork so that this could work out.
Yeah, and that's actually what I find so interesting in following you, because you still have that very honest excitement when it comes to being able to write about video games and doing video game journalism as a profession. And I found that very interesting and very cheerful to follow. And it's also clear that you still have very, very much potential, and I can see your career going to much higher places. So it's exciting to follow and hope that things will turn up even better for you. So when it comes to your job, it's mainly writing, correct?
1 second, sorry. Sorry. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So when it comes to your job, it's mainly writing, right?
It's a fairly even split at this point. Like I spend every day, I do sort of 8 a.m. through 1 p.m. is all writing. That is just doing news writing. After that, my afternoons are generally a fairly even split between audio work, podcasting, video work, and written work. So I split my time fairly equally amongst those after I've got Distractoid writing done.
Yeah. When it comes to that writing part of your job, I think most people have some sort of grasp, at least, what makes a good piece of written fiction work. You need characters and things like that. But what about writing articles and writing reviews? What do you think makes them work? What do you need for a good article or review?
When it comes to sort of what I mainly do, which is freelance writing, I think the main thing that you need to get a good freelance pitch done is understanding what makes you unique as a writer and what it is about your writing that means that only you could have written this and no one else, like no staff writer on a site could have written it. It's like, what makes it unique to you? So usually that's like, what is it about my background or my unique combination of interests or whatever it is that happens to be, I have this perspective that is unique to me, other people don't have this perspective to draw from, and using that as a base to write from. That could be on the side of doing like, okay, well, here's this personal thing, so it's like, this is about gender or sexuality or something like that, or it could be much more to do with like, I did a very specific thing recently about volleyball, anime, and Pokemon pinball, because again, it's like, well, what are the weird things that I'm into that no one else is into? Let's use those as comparison points, and it's just finding whatever it is that makes your perspective unique to you, and that's where generally the interesting bits of content come from the places where it's like, no one else could have written this is uniquely something from me.
Okay. And as you said, you've done some serious articles, much fewer than those light-hearted ones, but when it comes to those, you have handled some rather heavy stuff in your work, such as the treatment of minorities, depression, and even suicide recently. When it comes to these kind of subjects, how do you think they are currently handled in gaming, and where would you want them to go in the future?
I think video gaming right now, in terms of serious subjects, we are at a point where games are able to be made on a much smaller budget by much smaller teams and with much more easily accessible tools. And what this is generally doing is it means that people are getting to tell much more personal stories. This is something that's really sort of unique to the last maybe half a decade of video games, that this has really flourished the last 5 years or so. We've started to see games like Gone Home and Life is Strange and things like this that mean that people can, where the big AAA industry is still scared to take a lot of risks on unproven topics and it's scared to be too serious on topics that haven't been broached before, the indie scene now has this opportunity to basically fill in where the sort of AA middle tier industry used to fit, and we're seeing really interesting stuff. We're seeing a lot of games that are finally taking those first steps to tackle serious issues. I think there's a lot of issues with how these are being handled. I think that Life is Strange is a really good example of a game that is trying really ambitious stuff with serious topics, but has made some serious missteps that, once the whole series is out, are going to be big talking points for critics, I think. I'm really glad that we are seeing like the Life is Strange level developers are trying these really serious subjects, but I think that we definitely have issues with how they're being handled right now, and I think the answer is not to say like, no, don't do these issues because you're making mistakes. It's like, no, you're making mistakes, but we're glad that you tried. Here's some criticism. Let's hope that this continues to happen. So I think we're in a good position with where serious attempts on games are at the moment, but like the place of critics at the moment is very much like, praise what is good, but definitely highlight where these problems come up in some of these attempts at the moment.
Yeah, and I very much agree with that. I myself see that the indie scene is where these subjects will be mostly handled. In the near future, I'm not so sure about the AAA industry. It's just the smaller indie games, they are able to be much more personal experience both for the players and the creators. Something like Life is Strange is a very good example, I think, because it has these themes of nostalgia and childhood and time, and it seems that every person in that team, from the graphic designers to the gameplay people, knew what they were aiming for, and whereas the AAA games seem to be stretching kind of everywhere because they try to be so big. So I agree that that's where things will come, and hopefully we're able to let them grow by themselves and become even better. Yeah. And then on a lighter note, as I mentioned before, you are known for this kind of gaming but sex games. niche. Where did that come from? Is it something that you thought would entertain viewers, or is it honest fascination with these things?
Honestly, it's something that I never thought would be a part of my career. When I launched Patreon back in October, it sort of came out of necessity. I very quickly had to work out if I had enough of a position that I could leverage myself into having a career in this industry. And I jokingly asked people on Twitter when I was launching my Patreon, like, okay, here's my next financial milestone I'm trying to hit. What would you like me to see me do that might, that you would pay money on Patreon to see me do? And someone jokingly suggested, I'd love to see you do a podcast about butts in video games. I thought it was a funny idea that I didn't take seriously. So I retweeted the tweet and thought nothing of it. And then I got about 40 tweets that all said, yeah, I'll give you money on Patreon if you do a podcast about butts. So I thought, well, let's give this a go. And it was a lot of fun, actually. Considering my job can be very serious sometimes, it was very nice to have a slightly silly piece of content that was a good excuse for me to talk to people that I enjoy talking to and just be a little bit silly with how serious I got about the subject. Equally, around that same sort of time, I did the first couple of episodes of the Podquisition podcast with Jim Sterling. And Jim Sterling is the kind of influence on me that very quickly, as I started talking to him, he brought out the fun side in me. There is a silly side of me that I didn't usually let have too much of a leash when I was working. And I think Jim definitely, for the better, sort of encouraged me to take some of the silly things about some of the times when video games can just be a bit fun and silly and exaggerate that. So I sort of got into playing some of these weird sex games just to have something silly to talk about. And then I found that it was a really fun outlet to sort of talk about things that other people weren't talking about, where it's just like, hey, video games don't have to be dark and serious. Sometimes they can be about having sex with a fish, which is a bit of a silly idea. Ha ha ha. And it was just fun to have a bit of a laugh with people. So it breaks up the slightly difficult aspects of writing about serious stuff all the time, because that can be really emotionally draining. So if I've written something emotionally draining, maybe I just want to laugh at a butt for a while and that'll cheer me up.
Is it something that's confined in your work, or are you that open about this subject in real life also? Because I remember one Podquisition episode where you were talking about a certain sex game, and it took me a while to realize that I have played this very game, and it's like one of my darkest, deepest secrets, which I will never tell about, even to my closest friends.
I'm very curious which one you've played now.
I won't tell you.
Oh no!
Not while the camera is on. And you were talking about it in front of thousands of people. Are you just naturally that open?
That's a difficult question. I've never been a very open person. I grew up, for various reasons, just being very closed off and insular. I was a very sort of introverted person, and that's being very open never really came naturally to me. And again, I think I have Jim to thank for a lot of that. Basically, he's the kind of personality that when I talk to him, he's very easy to bounce things off, and he gave me a lot of room to feel safe experimenting with a bit of a persona, and that I think it's helped in my general life. I think since I've been doing the Podquisition, and since I've been doing the Gaming Butts podcast, and since I've started doing these bits of content that are a bit sillier but that require me to be a bit more outgoing, I've definitely become a bit more open about stuff just in general. So yeah, I think before I started doing all this, I wasn't very open at all, but when 50,000 people have heard me talk about having sex with a fish, at that point, what have I got to lose by not being open?
Yeah, I understand. So how about your future? Because you have already, during this year, reached many of the milestones you set for yourself. You are currently employed via full-time writing. and you have reached all your Patreon milestones as well. Are there any kind of goals in the future you would like to achieve?
Yeah, well, back in September 2014, I set a series of goals for myself that were primarily goals before I turned 25, and that was on my 23rd birthday. So I was like, okay, by September 2016, I want to be making a full-time living from writing. I want to be I want to have been hired as a staff writer for a site that people have heard of, and I want to have had half a dozen pieces published on big name sites. And I broke all of those targets within 6 weeks. That was my 2-year plan that I broke in 6 weeks. And that was really scary because I was suddenly like, oh, what do I do? And everything's kind of, right now I am looking at each opportunity as it comes up. I've not really looked at long-term goals. The big one for me that I've yet to manage, that is my sort of 2015 goal still, is I want to get a freelance feature published on IGN. I've yet to get something I've written published on IGN, and IGN's the site that mainly, like, when I was about 15 or 16, I used to love listening to their podcasts, and I got very into the personalities there, and for a long time, like, that was the site that I looked at to be like, that is the holy grail of writing about video games, and that has been a goal for a long time. So that is, I think that's the only long-term target I have right now is, by the end of this calendar year, break into IGN and get something published there. Otherwise, it's much smaller goals for me this year. I'm going out to E3 this year, which will be the first time I've made it out to America for E3. I'm going to be covering Gamescom, which, again, that's a first for me. And the big one for me is just keep making new bits of content and hopefully keep this writing about games thing going, because it's been going for 6 months now, and that's already longer than I ever thought this would last. So if I can make this last out this year, then that's a milestone, and then I'll be like, okay, let's do another year, another 5 years, and however long this crazy ride goes.
Okay. Well, hopefully you will have a long and successful career. And speaking of that, why don't you tell all of the viewers where they can find your work and where they can follow you?
Okay, well, if you want to follow my work, the easiest place is Laura K. Buzz on Twitter. That's where I tweet out links to everything I do. If you follow me on there and you start being like, oh, I like this person's work, I want to help support the creation of Butts podcasts and whatnot, I have a Patreon at Laura K. Buzz, so patreon.com/Laura K. Buzz. Other than that, Laura K. Buzz on pretty much anything. So I have a bunch of podcasts. You can search Laura's Gaming Butts, the Indie Haven podcast, The Geek Night In, Category Video Games, Ono Video Games, Year of Steam, Podquisition, Podtoid, Destructoid UK, all of those. Just Google them, you'll find them, or just search Laura K. Buzz podcasts and they'll probably come up anyway. So yeah, that's probably the list.
Yeah. Okay, good to hear. Thank you so much for humoring me and joining me, and thank you for all the viewers who are watching this interview, and that's it, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.